My bio was on the website, I didn't have it out, but I'm a native of Tulsa County. I grew up in Oxford. My first ancestor, Darby Callahan, came here in 1680 in Canal. So like I say, I got almost 350 years of Maryland and Eastern Shore history running through my veins. I vividly remember my grandfather when I was a young kid talking to my fathers and uncles once at dinner about Maryland history. Some was about the Civil War. So probably I got my love for history from my grandfather himself. So I grew up in Oxford, went to doctorate school for a couple of years, St. Peter and Paul, went to college. After college, I accepted a commission in the United States Marine Corps. And I got to go to flight school and fly F-18 aircraft. Nothing better in your 25s or 30s to get a brand new fighter you can fly. However, the Marine Corps wanted you to be a well-rounded officer. So in between flying tours, you had to go do a non-flying tour. And the job I kind of chose, kind of assigned, was I went to Washington, D.C., and I worked arms control treatments. And at first I thought the worst thing in the world to be out of the cockpit, but I got to go to some really neat places. And here I am in Romania, checking out MiG-21 as part of the arms control inspection. I spent a lot of time in Moscow, Hungary, Baku, and during the fall of the Soviet Union, I spent a lot of time over there delivering humanitarian relief during Operation 502. A lot of time I spent in Hungary. I got to meet a very interesting Hungarian officer who was kind of my escort, Lieutenant Colonel Sabo. Lieutenant Colonel Sabo had been in the Russian army as an intelligence officer, so he spoke perfect English. And I got to ask him what it was like to be grow up in a communist regime. And him speaking English, one of the things he did was listen in to our communications. And he understood that the Soviet Union wasn't what it was supposed to be, what we were being told, and Americans are better, but he said you had to play the game. You had to be a card-carrying communist, had to go to meetings if you wanted your kids to go to school. And so then I also asked him, why did you become an intelligence officer? What made you do that? He said, well, I had really good grades in school. And they recruited me. And he said, well, really good grades except for history. And I said, Lieutenant Colonel Salo, why didn't you have good grades in history? He says, well, I'd study the people, I studied events and the dates, and then when I go in to take the exam, the government had changed it. So, it's a true story. And it is a lesson. When our news is controlled, when we are fed what they want to feed you, when they change your history, they control your thinking. And they control what you think and what you decide. And that's the one thing I noticed when I was over in the former Soviet Union. People realized it was bad, they had no clue how bad it was, because they had been lied to their whole entire lives. So that makes a very good story from my background. There have been thousands of books written about the Civil War. However, there has been just one written about the constitutional crisis experienced in Maryland, right here. Book front cover is our Tulsa County Courthouse. What a better example of democracy's fallen. It went federal troops and provost marshals enter our courthouse, beat our judge, and drag him to prison, a charge or trial. Book's 424 pages. It's highly sourced. 870 endnotes. It cites nearly 1,100 independent sources. I did not write this history. All I have done is organize it that hundreds of other people throughout Maryland and even on a national level have left a written report. During this lecture, you're going to hear history presented both about Maryland and the Lincoln administration has never before been told or presented in any book or text, which I uncovered during my research. Pretty tall allegation for some young Marine officer from Tulsa County, but you'll see for yourself. Little administrative function, we got 3 classes. There's so much material to cover. And how I organize it is this. This first class is about pre-Civil War history, Maryland's democracy, and we're going to talk about Baltimore and the police commissioners. I found it's better to go that line of fall to completion because so much happens in the summer and fall of 1861. We don't want to jump around. So we'll talk about Baltimore and the police commissioners after an introduction. And when we come back on the next class next week, we back up a little bit to April 1861. And that's when the governor convened the special session of the legislature. And we're going to see what did they do? What did they do? What did they put out? And we're going to follow them through their imprisonment, their arrest and imprisonment. And then in the third class, we come back again and we back up to the fall elections. 1861. And we are going to talk about the elections of 1861 through 1863. It's also during a class, we'll talk about General Tench Tillman, the General of Oxford, and Judge Carmichael. We just talked about, I got to do that for importance. A little bit of course rules, questions at the end, which we already said. Courteous and open discussion for everyone. Respect for all views and opinions. And no continuous arguments or personal attacks. I've done lectures, different places, also with online forums. Once in a great while, you'll get someone who's like, because we're talking about violations of liberties, we're talking kind of dark side of Lincoln in some people. Well, that is their president, and they do not want to hear anything negative about their president. They won't believe it. You must be lying. There must be conspiracy. There must be whatever. And it can be very disruptive. Does that apply today? I don't know. But that's, so we're going to keep it, even if you don't want to believe anything you see today or hear, let's not make it into an attack or anything. Current politics are off limits. When I say that, the number one I get a comment with my readers is that this history applies to today because our democracy, like I believe, is in trouble. And I want you to relate to that. I do not want to talk about Trump or Biden or January 6th. We can talk in general terms, okay? If there's anything I want you to come from my book in this lecture, which I've learned from my life experiences, being in the Soviet Union, and later I worked for this keeping my efforts about Castro regime and research this book, is that I don't care if you're far left or if you're far right, if you're white, black, whatever, LGBTQ, gay, we are all have a common ground. What binds us as Americans is the Constitution of the United States. That is our common ground. And that is one of the greatest documents in the world. And that is one of the only things that separates us from the schmucks that I saw in Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, China. And trust me, human nature is the same world over. There is ambition and the lust for power. If we did not have a constitution, we would be in the same boat as they are with totalitarian governments. So I hope that we get from this class a respect and admiration for our constitution. And if someone in the future wants you to let's set aside because we need to do this, think twice. That's just my own personal. When dealing with President Lincoln, I find motivation in another son of 12 account, Frederick Douglass. Douglass was asked to give a speech at the dedication of President Lincoln's Emancipation Memorial. That was the first memorial to President Lincoln. During his speech, Douglass paused and said, "Truth is proper and beautiful. At all times and all places, and it's never more proper and beautiful than when speaking of a great public man whose example is likely to be imitated long after his departure." Douglass then went on and highly criticized Abraham Lincoln. Frederick Douglass stated that he was doing this for the wise men who shall come after us and study the lessons of their history. I like to think that's us, wise people after me. And if you ever want a really honest analysis of President Lincoln and his policies, I refer you to Frederick Douglass. I don't think he made it more honest. For a war that modern historians have estimated has cost over 750,000 American lives, destroyed 11 major U.S. cities, and left a huge portion of our country in economic depression for generations to come. It is our right, maybe even our obligations as citizens of a democracy, to evaluate the policies of our government. A little bit about our sources, primary sources. Number one is the War Rebellion, the official records of the Union Confederate Army. I got one copy right here. The whole set is 129 volumes. Huge amount of material, official records. Well, guess what? I found where the University of Oregon had digitized it. Keyword searchable. How cool was that? This is what differentiates some young guy from Tulsa County, well, I'm not going to do work, that can do research that's far beyond what someone could do 15, 20, 25 years ago. And the best, by the way, I found some of the best stuff where it wasn't even supposed to be. Interesting, fascinating. Other primary sources, the Maryland State Archives Online. Everything that legislature did back in 1861, their journals, every public document, everything. It's right there. You can bring up your cell phone. You can bring these documents up right now on your cell phone. And one cool thing about my book, you can have all these sources. You can go right to your computer and read the entire document. I didn't have room in my book to put everything, but I paraphrase. You can go back and look at it all yourself. And it's right there. Just give you an example of how rich this information is in our state archives. So a little closer. And it's almost like a historical text of itself. Here we got a copy of the proposed amendment to the Constitution of the United States. That's the amendment that President Lincoln sent out to the states and sent to America. We'll talk more in detail in the next class what the legislature did. Here we go, report of the police commissioners of Baltimore City with accompanying documents. This is after they were imprisoned. They sent a protest to Congress. They sent a copy of the protest to the legislature. It's detailed right there. What else do we find here? Message of the governor in relation to his disarmament of the military. You will find another historian that talks about how Governor Hicks disarmed the Maryland militia. It's right here. And also, we have so much documentation about that. And we will talk about that during this class, how Maryland was disarmed. A little more report of the peace commissioners appointed to wait on President Lincoln and Davis in June 1861. Maryland's legislature did not want war. They sent out peace commissioners. And their goal was to try to stop any hostility until Congress got in session. Maybe Congress would work things out to avoid bloodshed. Well, President Lincoln didn't call Congress to convene until July 4th, in fact. And what else we got here? Too much. Protest in the General Assembly against the illegal arrest and imprisonment by the federal government of citizens of Maryland. Gives you a good idea what's going on in Maryland. But each one of those is just a wealth of information. Then we have newspapers.com. Newspapers.com holds thousands of historical newspapers which we search using keywords and narrow to a time frame or location. This was established in 2012. This is a brand new technology to use as research. And here's to give you an example. And this is why I wrote this book. I was interested in our local history. I wanted to research General Tench Tillman. So I plugged in, I'm going to use a laser pointer here. I don't know if it's going to show you. I plugged in Tench Tillman in August, put some dates in here, and looked for a location. And this is only a snapshot of multiple pages that came up. And on newspapers.com, you would click on this link and it would take you to the whole page. But look what we got here. General Tench Tillman emphatically denies Chicago Tribune, August of 61. Look down here. General Tench Tillman of Maryland, Western Daily Press, Bristol, Avon, England. One below it, the Preston Chronicle and Lancashire Advertiser, Preston, Lancashire, England. What I found was that there was multiple articles about General Tench Tillman as a primary character. And I found it in late August and early September, I found it in every major paper of the United States, in every major paper in Canada, and I found it in every major paper in English-speaking Europe. It could be in the French and Spanish. I don't speak those languages, so I didn't check. Dozens and dozens and dozens of major papers are talking about General Tench Tillman. He was more famous at his time than Robert E. Lee. That makes Battlefield Review. But he was the main character of these newspaper articles. And we're going to talk about that in the next class. What happened? Foreign primary sources, what I like to use. Here's George William Brown. He's the mayor of Baltimore. He wrote a book about the April 19th riots. First-hand account information, very good source. And then we have Frank Key Howard. He was the editor of the Daily Exchange. He was imprisoned. He came around his house around 2 o'clock in the morning on September 12th. Because they wanted to shut down his paper. They took him to Fort McHenry. And notice his name, Key. Well, guess what? He was a grandson of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. So Frank Key Howard woke up in Fort McHenry next morning in the jail cell shackled. He looks out his window and sees the flag of the United States flying above him. And he realizes this is the anniversary of bombardment of Fort McHenry, when his grandfather wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. The anniversary. He thought about the words his grandfather wrote, Land of the Free, and he looks up and goes, how ironic. Anyway, he wrote a book after he got out of prison, 14 months in American Bastilles, and the publishers, in his publishers 1863, publishers were in prison. Frank Key Howard was one of the group of political prisoners in Maryland who said after the elections of 1861, they started letting some of the prisoners out on parole, kept some, and then 6 months later, there was a commission that interviewed them, And the whole source of the interview, well, what are you going to do? Will you agree not to be politically active? Will you agree not to say anything? Will you agree not to write? There was a group of Maryland political prisoners. We are Americans. We have our rights in the Constitution. We have violated no law against our country or the Constitution of the United States. We have been in prison as free men, and we will leave here as free men, and we will not accept any terms of our release whatsoever. And that's how. And they stayed in prison for 7 or 8 months longer until they finally said, just let them go. Very interestingly, one of the last places they stayed was in Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. Colonel Dimmick was the commanding officer there. Colonel Dimmick was a fairly decent man. He realized these political prisoners plight. He gained such respect for him. After the war, Colonel Dimmick actually came to Baltimore, and some of these men hosted him. But anyway, 14 Months in American Embassy is a wonderful source of information. Then we have Senator Theophilus Wallace, correspondence with Senator John Sherman. Again, Severn was the chairman of the Federal Relations Committee on the Maryland legislature, imprisoned. And when he got out, he wrote these letters back and forth to Senator John Sherman saying, I challenge you to provide evidence against any of us who were imprisoned. He goes, the legislature had voted that we had no constitutional authority to secede. We had no intention. We made no attempt. We did nothing to construe as hostile. Our sessions were open to the public. Our journals were open to the public. People came in and this and that. And yet you say we were trying to do big plans of sessions. Where's the evidence? And that's a very interesting thing. Use Senator John Sherman and Senator Theophilus Wallace. These sources are just an example of many use, but it's a synergy of the War Rebellion official records, Maryland State Legislature archives, the newspapers, other historical early historians who were alive at the time, such as Thomas Scarf, Matthew Page Andrews, Harold Manakee, Frank Kent, and Clayton Coleman Hall. Between a combination of them, we build a very accurate picture of what happened in Maryland during the time. And a little spoiler alert, is something very different we're taught in grade school. I also have to mention to some modern historians. We have Mark E. Neal, who won the Pulitzer Prize. He wrote The Fatal Liberty about Abraham Lincoln and civil liberties. And also we have Noah Feldman, The Broken Constitution. He really analyzed President Lincoln's violations of the Constitution in great detail. And Noah Feldman is the constitutional law professor, or was, at Harvard University. So we got a very good source here. And by the way, Feldman asserts that by any measure, the President of the United States at the time had assumed powers that would be considered powers of the dictator. Locally, for Tulsa County's, a lot of people in Tulsa County love Dixon Preston's book, Tulsa County A History, not the history, A History. There's 20-some pages in there about Tulsa Civil War history. And it was an excellent guide for me, for research. I say guide. Why is that? Because he hit the big stuff. He hit the Committee of Safety, Judge Carmichael, H.H. Goldsboro, the Union troops raiding the armor. However, it's not a primary source. For one, Dixon Preston wasn't alive, didn't witness it. Published in '83, he was a New Yorker. Nothing wrong about that, but he didn't understand Maryland history or pre-Civil War democracy. He didn't cite any of his dissertations. I mean, he had no footnotes, 0 footnotes. Couldn't tell what was his opinions or what was actually fact. And what I found, you can't differentiate source, and with my research, I found a lot of what he wrote was factually wrong. For example, like Committee of Safety was taken over Tulsa County. Well, he failed to realize the Committee of Safety had been used as a Revolutionary War time. In fact, the Committee of Safety actually ruled Maryland for a little while after the Revolutionary War. And any time they're in crisis, they establish a Committee of Safety. People that are familiar with military people, how to advise. He talked about H.H. Goldsboro, but he didn't realize that H.H. Goldsboro was a state senator from Easton. He's most staunch unionist in the legislature. And he didn't quite catch on that. And a few other things are just factually wrong. So it's a wonderful book about the history of Tulsa County, but there's 20-odd pages of Civil War, take it with a grain of salt. Okay, and the other thing, he does at the end say, I read this and I read this. He never mentioned about anything in state archives or War Rebellion. He basically used local newspaper articles. He did say he used Thomas Scarf about Goldsboro. I mean, Scarf's assertion and Preston's, they're totally different. So just a source there on Preston. Otherwise, the rest of it was wonderful. All right. The story of Maryland cannot be told in isolation, since Maryland was part of the national events leading up to the Civil War. There is a lot of misunderstanding and confusion of the Civil War, so it is best to provide a very brief, only 10 minutes overview leading up to the war for background information. It's just big picture orientation of pre-Civil War history, and there's no better place to start than with the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States was drafted in 1787. Though the Declaration of Independence spoke of all men being equal, a new nation comprised of the states could not be established without slavery. Democracy was new and had never before been successful. But slavery had been practiced in every nation since the beginning of civilization, and no nation on earth had abolished it at the time. It was too much to establish both a democracy and a nation free of slavery. Hence, the U.S. Constitution both allowed and protected slavery in a new nation. And it did this in, first of all, the Constitution did not speak of slavery in itself. It referred to slaves as other persons or persons held in service or labor. The framers of the Constitution believed that slavery was dying off, and they did not want the word itself within the document. Regardless of what they called it, the effect was the same, and the Constitution protected the institution of slavery. There were three provisions in the Constitution that protected slavery. One, the 3/5 compromise, expressed that the number of congressmen will be determined by adding the whole number of free persons and 3/5 of other persons. Then the Constitution protected international slave trade for a period of 20 years. And you couldn't stop it. But actually, to the credit, in 1808, when this 20-year expired, they did outlaw international slave trade. In fact, the Confederacy, and this is not Confederate, they also outlawed international slave trade. And that's a misconception some people have. They think that international slave trade was going on all the way up to the Civil War. But it was outlawed in 1808, but the Constitution protected it. And finally, the Constitution demanded that no person held in service of labor in one state escaping to another shall be discharged for such service or labor. And this came to be known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island had passed legislation to end slavery by the summer of 1787. And by a full 2 decades, they had led the nations of the world in ending this barbaric practice. And that's something to be proud of. But the process of abolishing slavery in these early states held to a very distinct pattern. First, the economics of slavery would decline, and then the moral implications would set in to move the state towards abolition. It was always in that order, economics first. Slavery was declining in the early nation until the development of a technological invention that changed decline in the new nation. And I think we all know what that technological invention was. Eli Whitney's cotton gin. With the cotton gin, a type of cotton called short staple cotton could be economically processed. The type of cotton that had been grown up to this point was long staple cotton, which could only be grown in a very narrow band near the coast. Short staple cotton could be grown in far greater geographical areas. Thus, the cotton gin opened a huge geographical area that could grow cotton, which became known as the Cotton Belt. This transformed the agricultural economy of the South. The entire economy of the Deep South became dependent on king cotton. The growing of cotton, however, required a huge amount of labor, and thus the national climate of slavery reversed. With their economy and fortunes tied to cotton, the cotton states needed to protect the basis for their economic engine, the institution of slavery. The growth of our nation, however, upset the political power. National growth would be by the addition of new states and not enlarging the existing state. Each state had 2 senators, regardless of population, and the slave states could preserve their economic engine if they at least had parity in the Senate. Vast amounts of land were obtained from the Northwest Territories through the Louisiana Purchase and from the Mexican War. The Whig Party helped establish the Missouri Compromise, which worked for about 30 years, adding states in slave and free pairs, keeping political power balanced. However, with the gain of so much land after the Mexican War, the Missouri Compromise became unworkable. The Whig Party was known as the Party of Compromise, and with the death of its leaders Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the party dissolved. With the Whig Party gone, and with the rise of the Republican Party in its place, the powerful forces to promote compromise were gone, and a nation became extremely divided politically, with a refusal to find compromise. By 1858, the number of free slave states were greater than that of the slave states. Thus, the slave states were losing their power in the U.S. Senate. With the rise of the abolition movement, they feared that the basis of their economic engine would soon be in jeopardy. By the eve of the Civil War, the number of free states had grown to 19, while the slave states remained at 15. Unwilling to compromise, and with the political parties taking extreme and opposite positions, the political parties fractured. The Democrats divided into the Northern and Southern Democrats, and with the demise of the Whig Party and the rise of the Republican Party, we see the creation of the Constitutional Unionist Party. There will be a four-way race in the presidential election of 1860. But what is interesting, with the conflict over slavery leading up to the election, no candidate proposed a reasonable solution. 30 years prior, the British had abolished slavery throughout its empire. Understanding the economics of slavery, the British government refused huge financial resources in the amount of 5% of their GDP to transition from slave labor to free labor. It's kind of like saying, let's just stop using oil. You need to have a transition. And between 1813 and 1854, at least 11 other countries had abolished slavery without bloodshed. But somehow we failed to use any of these events as an example to move forward in the United States. And as you know, President Lincoln won the election with slightly less than 40% of the vote. Immediately after the election, 7 southern states of the Cotton Belt seceded from the Union. President Buchanan was president when those first 7 states seceded. Buchanan consulted with his attorney General Jeremiah Black, and they jointly determined and publicly proclaimed that there was no constitutional authority to use force against the seceded states. But then in March, the inauguration of President Lincoln was on March 4th, 1861, far later than we have today. And the chief U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Roger B. King from Maryland, swore Lincoln in. And one of the very first things that President Lincoln did was to forward to the states the constitutional amendment known as the Corbin Amendment. We saw that in their archives. The Corbin Amendment would have forever prevented the federal government from interfering with slavery when it didn't exist. So this goes to one of the misconceptions about the Civil War. Lincoln was fighting to abolish slavery. Well, the first thing he did is try to protect slavery. And a little more about the Corbin Amendment. It's ratified by 5 states in the Union, plus Virginia. 6 states in all actually ratified it, although when the war got going, there wasn't much motivation. 3 of these states that ratified the Corbin Amendment were not even slave states. So now we have Fort Sumter. President Lincoln's generals advised abandoning the fort since it held no military value. Lincoln saw an opportunity. Lincoln told the commander of Fort Sumter not to surrender, and he sent a well-publicized resupply convoy to the fort. The battle for Fort Sumter was on April 12 and 13, and there was no one killed. But the North became enraged, and the public of the North called for war. Lincoln, getting around the fact that only Congress declared war, cited that he was unable to enforce the laws within the southern states, and called up 75,000 troops to enter the southern states and enforce the federal laws there. Congress was not in session. So Lincoln called for Congress to intervene, but not immediately, but on the symbolic date of July 4th, over 10 weeks in the future. The southern states viewed this as a declaration of war against them. Many states, including Maryland, believed military coercion of the states was both unconstitutional which President Buchanan had recently proclaimed, and it was a direct violation of their democracy. Lincoln's call out of troops to militarily coerce the 7 cotton states caused 4 more states to secede. These states had previously considered and even voted on secession, but had decided to remain in the Union. However, Lincoln's decision to use military force against the states did not sit well with them, and they refused to supply their men, their money, and their resources to militarily coerce other states. They believed that the military coercion by the federal government was unconstitutional, and they then voted to secede. Though the primary reason, but not the sole reason, but not the primary reason for the original 7-state secession was protection of slavery. The primary reason of these 4 states to go into secession was the federal government's policy to militarily coerce the states. And that's the big battle, Civil War. States' rights, slavery, maybe a little bit of both. Depends on where you sat, what state you're in. I also have to point out that there was 4 slave states that remained in the Union. And President Lincoln took no action against slavery in these states during the entire war, and even after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which had no impact on slavery in these 4 Union states. Then on June 20th, West Virginia officially broke from Virginia, and it was admitted to the Union as a slave state, making it the 5th slave state in the Union. All right, now with the background covered, let's turn to the subject. The most important part itself is Maryland. The subject of this lecture. Maryland, surrounding the nation's capital, and Baltimore City was the nation's 4th largest, with its primary trade in the north. However, to get to Washington from the north, the main routes went through Baltimore. Look at the geography of Maryland, with its huge borders and no natural barriers, and divided by the Chesapeake Bay. Marylanders in 1861 were very cognizant of the fact that Maryland would be impossible to defend. We will briefly review Maryland's political settlements, Marylanders' view of democracy, and of course, slavery in Maryland. This is lagging.
It has been the whole time.
Has it always been lagging the whole time?
Yep.
That much?
It's usually showing up about the time you finish talking about it.
Wow, that's part of this internet. Okay, man, I really worked hard timing all these. So I'm just wait. Anyway, I'll try to hit the button a little earlier. Okay, so let's go in here. This is really interesting. Maryland political settlements. The significant majority, through my research and all this stuff, but the significant majority of Marylanders did not want secession, but they were very unified against using military force against the states. John Thomas Scarf, in A History of Maryland, the earliest period to the present day, which was published in 1879, would write, while 4/5 of the people of Maryland at this time regarded the course which had been adopted by the cotton states as rash, hasty, unadvised, and called for, yet there was one point upon which we believe the people of the state were almost unanimous, and that was against the idea of coercing the southern states by the physical power of the federal government or the northern people. Scarf's assertion has been backed up by my research of Maryland historical newspapers and the journals and publications of the Maryland legislature of 1861. Military coercion against the states and the federal violations of the Constitution and Maryland state sovereignty was by far the overwhelming concern of Marylanders at that time. Lost my cursor. There we go. Marylanders view democracy. For Marylanders, wow, that's really slow. For Marylanders view democracy, we just have to look at the Maryland Constitution, the latest of which had been ratified by the people of Maryland in 1851.
Paul, is it any faster if you don't use, I'm wondering if it's the mouse.
No, it's not my mouse. I hit the button. Comes right up here.
And
Okay, there's the Constitution. Okay. In the Maryland Constitution, there was the Declaration of Rights. And the very first article, back up here. And the very first article stated that the people had the unalienable right to alter or abolish their government. Per the mode prescribed. Basically, the Declaration of Independence is what Marylanders believe. The people have the right to change their government whenever they want. There's a process in the Constitution to do it. Well, that's what was right there. And that's part of their beliefs of democracy. Okay, right. I think for Marylanders' view of democracy, we just have to look. Hang on. Getting off here. Okay, how do Marylanders practice their democracy? The citizens would assemble and discuss pertinent matters, and they would create resolutions which will be delivered to their elected officials. This was just related to them, to the officials, what those who assembled desired. It was non-binding. We didn't have communication back then, so they would post on the courthouse. We're going to meet on this issue on this day. Everyone come, create resolutions. Here, county commissioners, what we got. On statewide issues, they would announce it. We're having a convention in Baltimore. And you'd meet at the courthouse, and what do you want to say? What's our position? Here, you have delegates, and you send them up. And the same thing. They would have debate and everything else, and they come with resolutions. And they go hand it to the governor, hand it to the legislature. It wasn't binding. It was just communicating. However, historians have misrepresented the conventions held in Baltimore in early 1861, asserting that there was a convention on secession, as if it was an official action by the Maryland government. This misconception was derived from the extreme misrepresentations made by the Northern press at the time. Marylanders' view of state sovereignty. At the end of the Revolutionary War, Great Britain recognized and granted individual state sovereignty to each colony individually. Most Marylanders in the southern states view their state as an independent sovereign state that was in union with other sovereign states for the purpose of their joint and mutual benefit. After the Revolutionary War, Maryland remained an independent and sovereign state for 4 years until entering into a confederation with the other states in 1781 as the 13th state. So that's an important view that they viewed Marylanders first, almost kind of like the European Union, is how they viewed their country at the time. And we also know that before the Civil War, Europeans would say the United States are. After the Civil War, the United States is. So sometimes we apply our own view of our country back then, but it's important to think, how do they think about their country instead of how we think of it today? For Maryland's election data revealed that Lincoln received 2.5% of the Maryland vote. However, this was more than he received in all the states that would soon secede. The moderate political parties were the Northern Democrats and the Constitutional Unionists. Maryland was moderate in its political views and leaned slightly north. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that someone that voted for the Southern Democrats would also vote for Maryland secession. As we later see, the most ardent supporters of the Union in Maryland were Democrat politicians. Governor Hicks from Dorchester County and H.H. Goldsboro from Easton Tollett. Both were Democrats and both owned a significant number of slaves. Okay. Though a very significant majority of Marylanders did not want Maryland to secede from the Union, I found that there were two distinct types of Unionists in Maryland. Ones were considered unconditional Unionists, and the others described as constitutional Unionists. In this case, I'm not referring to the National Political Party, but a political belief held by Marylanders and were comprised of numerous political affiliations. Unconditional Unionists was a term, catch up, used in 1861, but few modern historians have used it. An unconditional Unionist, I'll just continue on, were in full support of the central authority of the federal government and believed the Union should be preserved at all costs, even by use of military force. They supported President Lincoln's use of extra constitutional powers and acts of setting aside certain provisions of the Constitution to support his policies. I put Matthew Andrew Page, that came from him, early historians. Constitutional Unionists was a term also used in 1861, but has not been used by modern historians since. Constitutionists were equally devoted to the Union, but as the name implies, believed in strict adherence to the U.S. Constitution and were dedicated to a federal policy of conciliation without coercion. Though they supported a union and wanted the southern states to return, they believed it was far better to allow southern states to live in peace with the hope of future conciliation to the immediate possible permanent ills of a tended union maintained by force of arms. This was the dominant political view of Marylanders, but this view was suppressed by the federal government. So a few definitions. Catch up here. If you read about Maryland history, Civil War history, you're inundated with certain terms. Southern sympathizer, secessionists, and traitors, terms we often hear. So let's someone here. Lynn Milkey, what is a secessionist? This is what we think a secessionist is.
Someone who secedes.
Someone who wants to see, actively participating. And that is correct. That's what we apply when we read this. A Baltimore secessionist, a secessionist of Baltimore, where they're trying to secede the state. That is correct, but it's also wrong. That's a very narrow definition. What we found is that the term applied to a secessionist was also someone who believed in the Declaration of Independence. Wait a minute, the Founding Fathers said that people have the right to change their government. I believe that they have the right to abolish and change government. Well, you're a secessionist. A pacifist, I don't want war. Well, you're a secessionist. You're aiding and abetting the enemy, or a sympathizer. Anti-war protester, secessionist. They label you a constitutionalist. I want to strict adherence to the Constitution. Now, the definition used in the Civil War was very, very broad. These terms should be viewed as on a sliding scale. I'm not sliding scale. That someone in Maryland might be considered to be called a sympathetic. The further north you go, they'd be a secessionist, or the term traitor was used quite often. But a common trait of a sympathizer and a secessionist and the terms traitor is they all fell into a specific group of the disloyal. Okay, so come on, man, that's out. Slide scale, this wall's coming up. Let's go to the next slide. Here's a great, because we're getting a newspaper article, I really like you to see this. So here's a article, and this tells a lot. I found it, newspaper.com. Baltimore Sun, May 7th, 1861. I'll just read it again. It appears in the editorials and correspondence of the Northern Press to represent the character and action of the legislature of Maryland as hostile to the administration and exhibited a tendency towards secession. Okay, if this is true, we confess ourselves to be totally ignorant of it and unable to perceive it. Moreover, we do not believe a word of it, and we are confident that any movement towards secession will receive an overwhelming rebuke from the popular sentiment, alike in the counties and the rural districts of the state. A natural and irrepressible sympathy with the cause of the Southern rights is constantly and willfully misinterpreted as a spirit of secession. In this thing, very great injustice is done to our citizens, and we are consequently placed in a false position to the general government. This is what our early historians around said, and this is something I found independently read in Baltimore Sun. Let's use another example. Boy, I wish it would come up. Examples of these traitors and secessionists. We got an article here, and this is from the Vermont Journal, May 18th, 61. Ross Williams, most flagrant traitor of the age in safekeeping in Fort McHenry, and will be tried for treason in the court-martial in Annapolis. The crime of treason is the only crime defined by the U.S. Constitution itself. And this is so that treason cannot be applied to opposing political speech or political candidates. But we see in the Civil War the gross over-application of the term. As you will learn later, Ross Williams was a Maryland House delegate and also a wealthy philanthropist who daily fed thousands of poor in Baltimore, both black and white, through his soup kitchens. Note also in the article that how he was to be tried by a military court-martial. He was a civilian. And Lynn, you will attest, the military, it's unconstitutional for a military to go try a civilian. You have a right as a civilian to be tried by a jury or peers in the area you're accused. already we're seeing some severe constitutional violations. Yes, a Maryland House delegate, and also shows how the military was conducting arrests. Guess what? The Constitution gives the military no authority or the president powers to arrest, particularly in states that are in rebellion. Judge Taney ruled that in Maryland, he pointed it out. The president has no power, the military has no power to arrest civilians. You go to the civilian authorities and have them arrested, bring up charges. But anyway, here's what I learned. General Butler had Ross Williams arrested. And this came from General Butler's autobiography, the general himself, that General Butler, it was intention to ensure his military court would find Winans guilty, that General Butler wanted to have Winans publicly executed in Baltimore to teach Marylanders a lesson. That if he could take a multimillionaire, one of the most prominent, and hang him publicly, well, that says something to you secessionist Marylanders. It also shows how quickly constitutional protections fell in Maryland. Okay, so here we go. Judge Taney, a traitor. John Merriman, a Baltimore traitor, the meanest type. So now we got some Supreme Court justice being labeled a traitor. Isn't that interesting? Here we go. MacArthur, a Democrat, in June '61. But we hold further that no traitor judge must be permitted to rescue his brothers in treason, even if the Constitution must be disregarded in so doing. Those who endeavor to subvert the Constitution have no rights under it, which the government is bound to respect. The North was calling to set aside the Constitution. They were okay with that. Who decides? If you don't have your rights in the Constitution, and who decides your guilt or not guilt? And if there's any further interference on the part of Judge Taney to aid the rebellion, he should be hung up like a dog. It's about time the old timers wiped out. Now a call for a Chief Justice's execution. A little much there. Okay. Began early in the Civil War and enabled by the suspension of habeas corpus, we see a change in the definition of loyalty. Look at that touch screen. Today, we think of loyalty to our nation as loyalty to the Constitution and all laws thereunder. However, during the Civil War, the definition of loyalty shifted as loyalty to the president and the policies he was implementing. The disloyal were suppressed by arrest, intimidation, and imprisonment. And why do I say the suspension of habeas corpus enabled the shifting of the definition of loyalty? With the suspension of habeas corpus, a citizen lost his right to be brought to a civilian court to determine the legality of his imprisonment. The courts would have judged the citizen using the Constitution and the laws derived therefrom. But political dissent, voicing an opinion, speaking out against the presidential policies is not a crime, but a protected right. And such citizens would have been immediately released by the courts. However, with the suspension of habeas corpus, effectively separated citizens from their rights under the Constitution. With the suspension of habeas, the federal government became the power that decided who would be imprisoned and for what reasons. With the president assuming his power, it was the executive department that made such decisions. A detailed study, particularly through the historical newspaper accounts, revealed that dissent, even in the most minor form, had become an imprisonable crime in the view of the executive branch. Some historians say, well, who cares if the president suspended or Congress? Trust me, you want Congress, they're going to suspend it. At least you got people on your political party in there that's going to oversee the other. You do not want the president. And that'll be tomorrow, the next class, more detail on that. So unconditional unionists were described as good union men. And because the constitutional unionists wanted peace, did not support the president's policies that violated the Constitution, they were considered disloyal and were included within the labels of Southern sympathizers, secessionists, and too often traitors. These terms became political labels that were overused, misapplied, and intended to stigmatize Americans who dissented or who held different political views. Once placed into the defective group, the disloyal, it became acceptable to strip those citizens of their constitutional protections and dispose of them at the will of government. Let's use some examples. The Daily Exchange, Baltimore, September 9, 1861. This is right before Frankie Howard got imprisoned. And I would like the slide to come up. There we go. Cowardly arrest of females. They were dressed in white and had bows of red ribbon in their shoulders, and which the nurses refused to remove. They were taken to the station house and confined for some time. This is kind of interesting right here. This is Mary's house, which was entered in at midnight by a mixed detachment of Zouaves and dragoons. Mrs. Marriott was subjected to the most inhumane treatment by these ruffians in uniform after breaking open their front door. Troops breaking open your front door in the middle of the night can arrest you. Fourth violation, right? The Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches. Fifth Amendment, also this article goes on, then when they left, they took some beef, they took a horse, taking stuff without compensation, military arresting civilians, military placement. There's a lot of stuff going on here, which Marylanders took notice. They did, they saw this. This is a little closer to home. Check this out, Easton, Maryland, when it comes up. This is the correspondence of Cecil Wigg about the Delaware regiment that was stationed here in Easton. And this is October 15th, 1861. There were one or two drunken fellows here who, when drank, would occasionally hurrah for Jeff Davis. One named Hamilton was arrested by Captain Ben Ricketts and a tall man on Friday night last, kept at the guardhouse for a few days, fed on bread and water. The poor old devil begged to get off. Hurrah for Jeff Davis. Let's feed you bread and water for a while, or rest you in prison you. This is a really good one. This is when I get into day 3 class on the elections. But I wanted to show you this now because also the use of treason and disloyal. The elections yesterday. This is about the statewide elections of 1861. This start down halfway. Throughout the city, as soon as the polls were opened, the federal police began to make arrests and continued until the police stations were filled to repletion. The charges upon which they were arrested were disorderly conduct, holding treasonable tickets near polls, using treasonable language, and attempting to pollute the ballot box by offering to vote a treasonable Democratic ticket. This is Baltimore Sun, November 7th, 1861. And this is one of the newspapers that was not shut down. So we kind of get a precursor about the elections and what they were doing. So you voted a treasonable ticket, you get arrested. I kind of like this one, arrest of an Episcopal minister on the charge of using treasonable language. He actually was giving a sermon, and they didn't like it. And later on, they would actually monitor some of the preachers, and you weren't supporting the union cause. And you could find yourself in a jailhouse, a preacher, for not vigorously supporting the union side. And this is one in Talbot County. Every Talbot County where I can. George Jones and Gator H. Roberts were also arrested for using disloyal language, who together with the former 7th Fort McHenry. Military arrest. William Block and F.M. Nielsen were arrested yesterday on the charge for cheering for Jeff Davis. Baltimore Sun, that's 1863. Jacob Hyde, Charles Valiant, his name is still around, Talbot County. Thomas Bromwell were arrested on Wednesday last in Easton Talbot, charged with disloyalty. Like someone else from Talbot County, charged with disloyalty. Later on, into the term disloyalty. Disloyal language, jail here in Easton. Okay, I want that. And this is my very favorite. This is my one very favorite I found in the Baltimore Sun. Arrest at Easton. The Democrats of Talbot County met at Easton on Tuesday last week. About 11 o'clock on Tuesday, the various delegations from different districts assembled in the courthouse and organized by the appointment of Thomas P. Williams, Esquire, to the chair when they made the following nominations. They're making nominations for the upcoming elections. So nominations for state's attorney, county clerk, register of wills, sheriff, orphans court, commissioners. Here's all the nominations. Surveyor, Tench F. Tillman. That's the son of General Tillman, we talked about. And a short time after they adjourned, Deputy Provost Marshal Thompson with a guard of soldiers arrested the following parties, basically arrested them all. And on down to Wednesday, T and Chance were also arrested. In the very bottom. The cause of the arrest is not stated, though the Gazette charged the parties with being rebels and secessionists. Well, that makes it okay then. Well, they're rebels and just arrest them. But you're starting to see how the labels being used, this is effective group. They all did, and what we found here, Tench Tillman, not long after this, we find Tench Tillman in Richmond. We found in National Archives his enlistment papers. He said, I'm not allowed to work in Maryland. I got family, so what they also did, if you fell into the group of disloyal, they wouldn't even let you work the trade. They could sometimes shut down your store. But Tench tried to run a surveyor of the county, probably couldn't work, and he was in prison for a while and let out on $1,000 bail. $1,000 in 1863 was a huge sum. And I guarantee you, in terms of the bail, is you're not running for office. That was quite common. Maryland's view of Lincoln's military objectives in 1861. This is from the Marylanders' view. So it's important to understand Marylanders' views of President Lincoln's war objectives as publicly communicated to them in 61 and 62. For Marylanders, the early war objective of the federal government was solely tied to the reunification of the states. It was not about abolition. President Lincoln stated so himself. My paramount objective is to save the Union, and it's not to either save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And then when Congress came into session in July, they put out a proclamation, a resolution to the people of the nation. And they said that the war was for reunification only, and everything else remained the same as before. So Congress is saying it's not about slavery. And then when the Maryland legislature met in 1862, the ones who got elected that fall, they put out to the people of Maryland, you see right on the top, 2,000 copies ordered and printed, the objects of the present war. And they cited the president's statements, and they cited Congress's resolution. And they said that to the people of Maryland that the object of this war is for restoration of the Union, just as it was before the rebellion broke out. So from a Maryland's perspective, it wasn't about abolition. Everyone was saying that, and they weren't fighting that. So now let's talk about slavery in Maryland when it comes up. And we're going to compare it to slavery in the Confederate States. With a plain out tobacco that required year-round labor and the transition to cereals as a primary agricultural crop in Maryland, slavery became far less important to the economy of Maryland. 47% of the total population of the Confederacy was comprised of enslaved persons. Come on. But in Maryland, 12.6% of our population comprised of enslaved persons, almost 1/4. The Maryland economy was not as dependent upon the institution of slavery as the economy of the cotton states. With the transition of agriculture, where primary labor was needed during only a few months of the planting and harvest season, it was far more economical to pay the going wages of $15 or $20 per month for labor, and where you did not have to feed, clothe, house, and provide medical. So you paid $1,500 for a person, you give them medical when you get sick. They didn't have to do all that. So economically, slavery is dying off in Maryland. Maryland was also extremely unique in that it held the largest free black population in the nation. 49% of all blacks in Maryland were free. This cultural aspect of Maryland sets it apart from both the states of the Confederacy and the states of the North. In Baltimore in 1860, Baltimore's black population was nearly 28,000 people. And in Baltimore, 92% of the black population was free, around 26,000. And doing detailed research, I don't want to quote this, I think there was only 2 or 3 people in Baltimore that owned more than 4 enslaved persons, or almost, I guess, house servants. But a huge free black population in Baltimore itself, integrated, working daily. Yes, it didn't have rights as citizens, but Maryland was unique, and we were in the process of transition. Though Maryland stubbornly clung to the barbaric institution, Maryland was in transition. With the economics behind slavery, Maryland diminished. Slavery was not nearly as strong as a motivation towards secession as it was in Confederate States. And I have to note, the percentage of free blacks in Maryland would have been significantly higher, but there was a law in Maryland that forbade the manumission of a enslaved person once they reached age 45, or if they're mentally or physically handicapped and couldn't care for themselves. So they assumed once you reach 45, you're too old to work. So you were required to care for them. You're just going to let them go. So that's kind of interesting. So we read these old articles, Aunt Ruth and this, that, but they were probably the older slaves that gave you a little cabin and help out with cooking, but the law would not let you free them once you got free. Or if you had a arm injury and you lost an arm or incapacitated or whatever. So that's kind of interesting also. I'm not defending the practice any bit. I'm just showing you the difference between Maryland and Confederacy and how it would be a motivational force towards secession. April 19th, entire books have been written about the Baltimore riots, but I just want to provide some key points since this was a significant event in Maryland and national history. Because trains were not allowed to pass through the city of Baltimore, the locomotives would be detached at the stations on one side, and the trains would be pulled to the city by horse, and then reattached to the locomotive on the other side. On April 18th, the day prior, was the first passing of federal troops through Baltimore on their way to Washington in response to President Lincoln's 75,000 troop call. And on April 18th, they were provided security by the Baltimore police. And though there were many angry anti-war protesters, the Baltimore police kept things under control. And there was no problem with their passing of federal troops. But the next day, on the 19th, Baltimore's police chief, George P. King, repeatedly telegraphed Philadelphia, but did not receive information as to when or where the Northern troops would arrive that day. There was multiple stations to the north on one side. Thus, the Baltimore police were out of position to provide protection when the Northern troops arrived in Baltimore. The Northern troops arrived in Baltimore that day anticipated problems. And before they arrived in Baltimore, the officers ordered their men to load their weapons. And if they were shot at by the crowds, they were to drop any person that shot at them. The purpose of the passing of the Northern militias was to force other Americans to bend to the will of the president. To the people of Baltimore, this was reprehensible, immoral, against their understanding of democracy, and it was the basis for their motions displayed in their protests. There were no specific leaders or advanced planning. It was an anti-war protest that got out of control. Some of the first cars of Union troops made it to the city, but then the tracks were blocked by the protesters, preventing the passing of any more train cars. The horses were put in the back of the cars and went back to the original station, and the troops dismounted and they intended to march through the city. As they marched, street pavers started being thrown, injuring some soldiers. It is not known which side fired the first shots, but the soldiers were ordered to fire into the crowd. 12 civilians and 4 soldiers were killed, with many wounded on both sides. 2 of the 12 Baltimore civilians killed were free black men. Learning of the violence, Mayor George W. Brown ran to the location of the Northern troops and marched alongside the soldiers in an attempt to provide them protection. Soon after, Baltimore's police chief, George P. King, with his policemen arrived on scene. And George P. King put themselves between the soldiers and the unruly mob to protect the soldiers. Marshal King ordered his men to shoot any rioter that forced their way through his police ranks. The last civilian death of the day, and the one that had the most impact on Marylanders, was the killing of Robert Davis by Union troops. Mr. Davis was near the tracks outside of Baltimore on the Washington side, inspecting some property with others. Mr. Davis did not know of the riots and the violence that had just occurred in the city. As the train cars of the Northern militia passed, Mr. Davis let out a cheer for Jeff Davis. The Union soldiers shot Mr. Davis dead. There were numerous witnesses to this event which provided sworn testimony in the later investigation. A telegram from Mayor Brown and Governor Hicks was immediately sent directly to President Lincoln, explaining to the president what had happened. It stated to send no more troops to Baltimore until they can get things under control. Also, a delegation from Maryland immediately left for Washington to personally deliver a written letter from Mayor Brown and Governor Hicks to the president expressing the same. Interestingly, President Lincoln, did not acknowledge or provide a response to this grave crisis, and the city authorities were left to act on their own responsibility. This was a major event and the very first bloodshed of the U.S. Civil War. However, President Lincoln did not respond. Spontaneously, the people of Baltimore had armed themselves and every weapon available for purchase sold immediately. The people of Baltimore began organizing their defenses, and even the free blacks of Baltimore volunteered to defend their city. Late that night, no reply from Washington, and word that more Northern troops would arrive in the city next morning, Governor Hicks ordered the bridges north of the city to be burned so as to prevent further collision between the Northern troops and the people of Baltimore. During the next several days, militias throughout Maryland came to Baltimore, and up to 15,000 armed Marylanders were in Baltimore shortly after the event. The next day, on April 20th, the Maryland delegation sent to meet Lincoln informed the mayor that Lincoln had provided a letter to the mayor and governor that he will send no more troops to Baltimore, and they will march around the city. Immediately, a second delegation from Maryland was sent to meet with Mr. Lincoln and his administration to coordinate with the president to prevent further conflict. Then at 3 a.m. on April 21st, Mayor Brown received a telegram from President Lincoln directing him and Governor Hicks to immediately come to Washington for yet another meeting with the president. Mayor Brown went to Washington to meet with Lincoln and his cabinet and General Scott. And during this meeting, the president assured the Maryland delegation that the Northern troops of Passion, Maryland were not intended for any purpose hostile to Maryland. The president agreed to send the Northern troops either by steamer to Annapolis or they would march around Baltimore and not go through the city. And just at the end of this meeting, the Maryland delegation received word that Northern troops were about to enter Baltimore from Cockeysville. The president turned to General Scott and says, turn the men back. Have them go back to Cockeysville. Do not enter Baltimore. Okay, we're working things out here. April 21st also is when General Benjamin Butler from Massachusetts arrived by steamer in Annapolis. So Governor Hicks told him not to land his troops in Annapolis. Butler did so anyhow at the Naval Academy. Butler took control of Annapolis at Washington Railroad, which had been damaged at some locations. But by April 25th, Butler had repaired the railroad and an open path to Washington was established. Immediately after the riots of the 19th, Baltimore entered into a period of armed neutrality. The Northern press was calling for the destruction of Baltimore, caused all Marylanders to become extremely concerned. The citizens were arming themselves, and the militias were coming to Baltimore from all over. The militias in Baltimore were placed under command of Colonel I.R. Trimble. The images of a steam gun, we'll talk about later next class, I think. It's kind of interesting. Here's some of the newspapers we find. New York Daily Herald, Cleveland and Boston. Bodies of men from all ranks are organized and prepared to leave at the earliest moment, determined to redress the outrages of their lives. The New York Times. Title, where shall we commence the war? If in Maryland, then Maryland must pay the penalty. If they are incapable of preserving order, we must supply the necessary force. If they refuse us passage through the state, we will carve one for ourselves. And New York Times. The vast mass of people were unanimously in favor of the strongest possible measures. The traitors had resolved on war, and that the more rapid and more terrible the war can be made to them, the better for the country. 2 words for Maryland. Here we go in the Boston Evening Transcript, April 22nd, right after. We shall preserve our right of way intact through Maryland. Keep the stars and stripes flying there, and extirpate the leaven of this unionism there. If the task needs half the men of the North, all the artillery, and the missiles of death to do it. Affairs in Boston. The Baltimore Sun will also publish articles saying, this is what the Northern press are saying, so that kind of anticipated things. That there will be free access to Washington is certain if it has to be established by arms, so much the worse for the Indian territory. Outlying invention and fashion, I will either find a way or make one, will be modeled in the next generation. So let's Baltimore beware if she would not have her monument stand hereafter, like the columns of Baalbek in the midst of desolation. Bottom here, let no one now indulge in regret at a probable destruction of Baltimore. Here we go, New York Times. Let me read the last part. She knows, beside and stupid as her legislature shows her to be, that the federal government, resting on North, has the power to float every living thing in Maryland down at Chesapeake to the sea and leave the state a desert. On April 22nd, the Governor Hicks convened the state legislature. And one of the first things he does, he had a meeting with Frederick, General Butler was in Annapolis. And one of the things he does is he sends the legislature his message, and he advises the legislature that we should maintain a neutral position. On the same day, on April 25th, President Lincoln gives General Winfield Scott an order about the legislature. And he says, we can't arrest them, but I want you to watch and wait for action. With it shall be to arm your people against the United States, he is to adopt the most prompt and efficient means to counteract, even if necessary, to the bombardment of our cities. As a Marine officer, I kind of take this to heart. The president should be trying to minimize as many casualties. He's instructing his general, they take arms against us, bombardment of cities. On April 27th, the legislature met with Frederick on April 26th. The next day, he put out an address to the people of Maryland. We know that we have no constitutional authority to take such actions about secession. You need not fear that there's a possibility that we will. They stated that Maryland will not secede. And they had 3,000 copies printed and put out throughout the state. On the 27th of April, President Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. That was supposedly between Philadelphia and Washington. What we find there's actually two orders he actually issued. One was for the press and one was for his generals. One of his generals was a lot, much broader. That was his first suspension. By the fall of '62, habeas corpus had been suspended throughout the entire United States. Now, what you're about to hear, you will not find any modern history book. The last time it was told was by historian George Radcliffe, published by the Johns Hopkins Press in 1901. My research found numerous additional primary sources, such as the original orders of General Scott, according to War Rebellion. And I found also historical newspapers. Though on April 21st, President Lincoln assured the Maryland delegation that the Northern troops passing through Maryland were not intended for any purpose hostile to Maryland, on April 28th, General Winfield Scott issues his attack plan against the city of Baltimore, with the primary commanders being General Patterson and General Butler. As part of the attack plan, General Scott passes to General Butler, President Lincoln's authorization that if Maryland takes arms against the United States to bombard our cities. And there's the orders right there. Oh, we lost it. That's amazing to me. 21st, Lincoln says, no hostile intent. On the 28th, they issued orders. Yes, city. On the 4th, May 4th, the New York Tribune publishes General Scott's plan of attack, and he states Baltimore's about to be attacked by 100,000 men. On the 5th, General Butler is ordered up to relay, and once he got in position on May 5th, the attack was ordered against the city of Baltimore.
You have 5 minutes, so if you want a Q&A to show up in the video.
Have I been over an hour already?
Oh, yeah.
I want to show it in 45 minutes. Okay, I got 25 more slides. All right, we're going
Well, we set it for an hour and 45 minutes.
okay.
I gave you 15 minutes.
We'll just skim through these slides. We'll get to the best parts. So we'll skim through it. Here's in the War Rebellion. The Cameron president wants the communications open. In the War Rebellion, this is General Scott's order to attack. In the War Rebellion, this is General Scott and Butler saying, the president wants the city bombarded, they take order, if they attack. Most likely, here's the New York Tribune, where they publish General Scott order saying Baltimore's about to be attacked by Fort Reliance by a force of 100,000 strong. George Radcliffe wrote in 1901, but the reason they attacked Patterson refused to move forward. Even Secretary Cameron telegraphed, move now. Patterson refused. Having uncovered what was happening, Baltimore capitulates. They public announcements. They did it by 3 ways. Through public. One, the city council announces, come on through. We're open for northern troops. Second thing he did is Colonel Trimble stands down the militia of Baltimore. And we see this right here. May 6th, Colonel Trimble stands down the militia, tells them go home. Thank you for your service. So then tell them to come through, to stand on the militia. The third thing that happened was by Governor Hicks. And Governor Hicks removes General Tench Chilman from command of the 2nd Division of the Maryland Militia. General Tillman was highly respected by General Scott, our top military commander. And right here you see, again, on May 6th, boom, Tennessee Talbot County, it's not a Walker Mission. It was part of the Battle of Baltimore to show capitulation. On May 7th, General Scott calls off the order, tells General Patterson to move administratively through Baltimore. And on May 9th, the Northern troops passed through Baltimore. On May 13th, General Butler, without orders, goes into Baltimore in the middle of the night and sets up on Federal Hill all these cannons facing the Baltimore. Quickly through here. Governor Hicks disarms Maryland. We'll just skip through that. But Governor Hicks started disarming Maryland shortly after 19, and there's numerous newspaper articles about that. Sending guns to Fort McHenry out of Baltimore, disarming the militias everywhere. And the best is War Rebellion. This is from General Dix, the Lockwood enclosed copy of letters I have passed between Major General McClellan and Governor Hicks and myself regarding disarming military companies. Governor Hicks was rewarded after he left governorships. He was given a generalship in the Union Army. Lincoln very much awarded him. Between May 9th and June 26th, thousands of troops passed through Baltimore, protected by the Baltimore Police Force, without incident. Then on the night of June 27th, 3 o'clock in the morning, 1,000 troops surround Marshal King's home, haul him off to prison. Marshal King said, "You could have sent me a note. I'll come to your office the next morning." The next day, the provost marshal, habeas corpus was denied. The next day, the Baltimore Police Force were decommissioned. Well, we got a provost marshal now to operate Baltimore on the June 27th. And the Baltimore Police Force quits in protest because they sacked the police commissioners. On July 1st, again at 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning night, 1,000 troops are used to imprison the Baltimore Police Force, or Baltimore Police Commissioners. That caused quite a stir. Just a few more slides. Imprisoned at Fort McHenry, habeas corpus denied. But what they did is they sent a protest to Congress, protesting. Congress queries President Lincoln. Congress passes a resolution. And President Lincoln replies. In answer to the resolution of the House of Representatives on the 24th, asking grants, I have judged it incompatible. I have to state that it's judged to be incompatible with the public interest at this time to furnish the information called for by the resolution. Interesting. Won't give it to you. Folks, it's been 162 years and no evidence has been presented by the police commissioners. And if I can just have a couple more minutes, I'll tell you why they were imprisoned. They were imprisoned because, one, they insisted they cooperated in every regard. They turned in their guns. They were disarmed. They helped protect federal troops. Baltimore was overwhelmingly occupied. The guns at Fort McHenry, and it was on why they imprisoned police commissioners. And the answer to that is what their tasks were to do. They were established by the state legislature. One, oversee the police force, and two, oversight and control of the state elections. Remember, we had elections that fall. And for that fall, the elections was for the entire House of Delegates, the Senate for governorship. And right here is an article in the Baltimore Sun. This is for city council elections, October 61. A report made, it appeared that 120 of the old judges appointed by the police board did not serve an election day. The majority of these have absolutely declined with grants for illegality. The provost marshal, with the police commissioners gone, the provost marshal now controlled the elections of Baltimore. Baltimore accounted for 1/3 of the state voting population. And now he also appointed the election judges. And that is all I have. And that's why the police commissioners were in prison, to control elections. All right, sorry I let you take so long. I thought it'd be an hour. Huh?
Very, very interesting.
Okay, it is interesting.
And we got you off to a rough start.
What's that?
We got you off.
We got a slow start. I do have some questions. I thought there's no answer. Why did they tell the Baltimore Police Commissioners in 19 in June, July? They want a conflict. You know, you went through the 18th. Why didn't Lincoln immediately respond? I mean,
So anyone with questions?
anyone with questions?
You have a mic so that you can ask and anyone can hear you. No questions? I think you left.
Yes, sir.
So many.
Stuff.
You may or may not know the answer to this. Why did Baltimore have this strange rule that the trains had to stop, be pulled by horses through the city and then hooked up on the other side of it? Didn't want to run people over the train?
That's excellent. The question was, why did Baltimore have a law that you couldn't pass locomotives through the city? I think the main reason was because of fire hazard. Because the locomotive put out these embers and burning stuff, and also a lot of smoke, a lot of steam.
Okay.
So I think the fire risk was certainly one of them. But does anyone else have an answer to that? Nikki?
What is noise?
Noise?
That would be.
Okay, noise.
And,
This is good.
and the potential.
Potential fire hazard. All right. Any other questions? Anyone from Zoom? They heard me? Did they hear any of it?
No, Sandra found her way to keep with this. Yay, Sandra. Well, it sounds like we're ready to finish. Thank you so much. You've certainly flooded our brains with a lot of